Hello and welcome back. After a summer hiatus, I would love to welcome you back to our monthly Asian Health Community Talks brought to you by the Stanford Health Library and the Center for Asian Health Research and Education, CARE for short, at Stanford. My name is Brian Lin and I'm one of the co-directors for CARE, and I'm really pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Rona Hu, who will be speaking about anti-Asian violence and discrimination. What to do. Dr. Hu is Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Clinical Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. She is Medical Director of the Acute Psychiatric Inpatient Unit at Stanford Hospital, specializing in the care of those with serious mental illnesses, including schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression. She completed medical school and residency in psychiatry at the University of California, San Francisco, and fellowships in pharmacology and schizophrenia research through the National Institutes of Health. She is also active in minority issues and cultural psychiatry and has received regional and national recognition for her clinical care, research, and teaching. I'm also pleased to announce that Dr. Hu has agreed to be our next director for psychiatry and behavioral sciences for CARE, taking over for the esteemed Dr. Alan Louie. So welcome, Dr. Hu, and again, great thanks for joining for your talk today. And also, I believe you've started a new clinic as well.
That's correct. The accolades that you mentioned already, I'm very proud of. And specifically, some of the things that I wanted to highlight for this talk was founding, before the pandemic, but also very active during the pandemic, the SMART Clinic, which stands for Stanford Mental Health for Asians Research and Treatment. And then years before that, Stanford CHIPAO, which is Communication Health Interactives for Parents of Adolescents and Others. And then I'm also very honored to have received the Kunpo Su Award for 2021 from the American Psychiatric Association, which is an annual award given to the person who has done the most to help Asian American mental health for that year. I think in years past I had been nominated but didn't feel ready for it yet. I hope that part of tonight is earning that superhero cape, if I may.
I think you've far out-earned that, so congratulations.
I usually start talks by saying how honored I am and pleased to get to do this talk. And for this topic, it's a mixed blessing, right? I'm not pleased that there's the need for this talk, and yet I'm honored to be able to do something about it. So just as I said before, I would like to be able to earn whatever superhero cape I've been granted, and I would like everyone who's participating tonight to also don superhero capes and be part of our efforts. I'll start with a slide on disclosures, which is the next slide. I have done research, speaking, and advisory boards for pharmaceutical companies in the past, but not currently, not for several years, and I have no conflicts of interest for this talk. As far as conflicts of interest go, as far as disclosures, I am Asian American. I treat all patients, many are Asian. In addition to the SMART Clinic, I've also been active in taking care of all types of patients in the hospital, whoever needs it most, and also in the clinic, the Inspire Clinic for treatment of psychosis. I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs. I think some of what I have learned in that position has been helpful in combating anti-Asian violence and discrimination. The SMART Clinic is entirely within Stanford, and the CHIPAO crew are all volunteers, most of whom are associated with Stanford, and some of whom are private people from the community, and I want to thank them all. Next slide, please. So that's it for disclosures. What we'll be talking tonight about includes history, some of my personal history, some about US history, not too much because there's more than we can cover in the amount of time, past and current, and then a slide where it's like, why ask why? Why are we talking about this? Some about mental health, because there is no health without mental health. And there's a stigma against mental health in American culture as a whole, but very much more so among Asians. And then talking a little bit about microaggressions. And this is the part where I want to talk about some very practical things. A guide for the victim, if you've had microaggressions done to you, for the accused, and also for the bystander, and how you can go from being a bystander to an upstander, and then coping strategies that we can start right now today. Next. So the original title for this talk, when I did it for the APA Kanpo Su Award, was called Saving Witch Asians. And the APA talk was done before the shootings in Atlanta. And so at that point, I felt like I needed to explain a little bit. And of course, the title Saving Witch Asians is a pun on Crazy Rich Asians, directed by John Chu, a local boy. So and son of Chef Chu. So Crazy Rich Asians, that's obviously not representative of everyone, but it's something that I think was the first time in 25 years since the Joy Luck Club where Asians were, front and center, part of not just heroes or villains, but, people. And so as I talk about a personal example, I have to tell you about when I was a medical student rotating through the obstetric service at another hospital, not at Stanford. And on my first day, a resident, an obstetrics resident, white male, told me Asians feel less pain, or Asian women feel less pain. And I thought, that's news to me. And but I didn't say anything because I was just a medical student. And then the very next Chinese mom who went into labor went, and he said, "What's that tongue clicking thing they always do?" And I said, "That's pain." And every time I tell this story, I can feel my heartbeat. I can still remember how it felt to realize that dozens, hundreds of Chinese moms, this is in San Francisco, were not getting enough pain medications because of this idea that Asian women felt less pain. Women with, with third degree tears, women with very difficult labors that weren't getting pain medication. And I also realized that when you believe that a certain group of people don't feel pain, then they become less human and their suffering doesn't matter as much. And so I think I was angry about that for a period of time. And it took a while to realize, of course, that the white male resident wasn't evil. He was just ignorant. And evil, I don't know if evil has a cure, but ignorance has a cure, and that's education. And then years later, years after I was a medical student, I gave birth to a 9.5-pound baby. And my own mother said to me, 千万不要, like 10,000 times don't. 10,000 times don't cry out. 10,000 times don't wiggle around. And I realized that it's not so simple as someone else believing that we feel less pain. It's also, if we allow this to happen, are complicit in this, do this, expect this of one another, expect this of ourselves. So a lot of what I'm doing today is talking about responsibilities that we all share and that we can do something about. Asian Americans in history have been discriminated against, stereotyped, scapegoated. The term scapegoating comes from the idea of heaping all the blame on an innocent goat and then, sacrificing it to the gods, which of course does no good at all. And then of course, this past year, violence. We've been blamed for the coronavirus. The previous president, I don't even want to mention his name, called it the Kung flu, as though it was something that we had created or that we were responsible for spreading. I've been masking, I'm vaccinated, I've been treating patients in the hospital. So that was incredibly hurtful and, of course, not accurate. And then these awful attacks on the elderly, some in Chinatown, some elsewhere, some in California, some elsewhere, where people just shopping, walking, are pushed to the ground and badly hurt. And then, of course, the shootings in Atlanta by people working in a spa, just doing their jobs, trying to provide for their families. We'll talk about challenges in getting mental health help, both inside the Asian community and outside the Asian community, things that we have been stigmatized, and also when things aren't accessible to us. And then I think a big part of our talk is what you can do now. And I should mention that you can put questions into the chat section, and I will try to leave 15 minutes at the end for as many questions as possible. Next slide, please. So some of the background is that the 2016 census, the 2020 census got a little bit messed up, but the 2016 census showed about 21 million Asian Americans, and we're not distributed evenly. I have another slide that I'm not showing tonight, but we're fortunate here in California, where I think most of the participants tonight are from, or where we live, that in the Western states and Hawaii, we're not as much of a minority, but overall, we're only about actually now 6% of the US population. That's a tiny part. We could easily become invisible. I have a colleague who grew up in Detroit, and she said that when the school was asked to count the number of Black and white students, the teacher said, asked the Black students to raise their hands, asked the white students to raise their hands, and said, wait, the numbers don't add up. And then all the kids looked at her, and she said, what are you? And all the kids turned around and looked at her. And then she finally said, well, your hair is straight, so I guess you're white. This can easily happen to us. We are often classified as one group or another, and it can be to our disadvantage. About 59% of Asian Americans are foreign born. And the reason I highlight this is because that also makes it easy to other us. I like to quote Constance Wu, the actress in Crazy Rich Asians, who was criticized for playing the mother in Fresh Off the Boat with an accent. And she said, being an accent is nothing to be ashamed of. It means you speak two languages. So this is something to keep in mind if anyone's ever made fun of your name, your accent, your voice. It means you speak two languages. We speak at least 30 different languages, and that's not counting some of the different dialects and subtypes. And so among these blocks of Chinese American being the largest at this point, Filipino American, Indian American, Vietnamese American, Korean American, and Japanese American, within these groups, there are at least 50 distinct groups. So we could easily be othered. We could easily be invisible. We could easily be set off against each other and against other people. We're very susceptible to that. So tonight's talk is very much about not having that happen. And remember, the model minority myth does not help us. For one thing, it makes people who aren't model minoritied resentful, right? It's like being the golden cousin or something among a group. It makes all the other cousins and siblings hate you. But it's also so it's not helpful. It's not accurate, and it's not fair. The model minority myth means that we don't have needs. It's like the idea that we don't feel pain, that we don't have suffering. Next slide, please. I'm only going to show one slide from Asians in America from our history. There's much more to it, but this is a notice of Japanese Americans being told to leave, sell their things for pennies on the dollar, if they got any money at all, have their homes and businesses taken away from them, and live in converted horse stalls in the most inhospitable environments possible. You probably know that the Tanforan racetrack nearby which became a shopping mall, was originally had been used to house many of whom were American citizens, born and raised in the U.S., some who had never been to Japan, but they were considered enemy Asians just for having Asian faces. Enemy aliens, sorry. That was an interesting Freudian slip. The U.S. was also at war with Germany. The U.S. was also at war with Italy. Italian Americans and German Americans were not rounded up and put in concentration camps. This is a painful part of history, but a memory of pain is also a memory of resilience. And those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. So remember also that the Chinese Exclusion Act, which started in 1875, and then 1882. There's different acts. It was, quote, repealed in 1943. But what does repealed mean? 105 Chinese were allowed to come in starting in 1943, 105 per year. So that's hardly opening the gates to Asians. Next slide, please. And then when I first started doing this talk for the Kunpo Su Award, I had a slide courtesy of Ravi Chandra of some of the anti-Asian violence. I've since then it's become I don't even put it on slides anymore because there's so much of it. I clip things from the newspapers. People send me stuff. This is I'm very paper based, but this is how thick my file is right now. And of course, it's not complete. It doesn't have everything. And this was before. This is when some of the anti-Asian attacks against elderly had happened, but it was before the Atlanta spa murders, and I've just not updated the slides since then. Next slide, please. So what do we do? What do we do? This is a slide of Dr. Grace Liu, one of my former residents, who, if we have time, I can tell you a little bit more about Chi Pao, but she plays a teenage daughter as we talk about parents and teenagers talking with each other. And the apron there, I don't know if you can see my, no, I don't know if you can see my I don't know if you can see my apron there, or you can't see my cursor, but the apron there and the watch band, and that's me playing the mother. Next slide, please. So what do? We could seek mental health help, but what's interesting is how unlikely we are to do that as Asians. Asian Americans are 1/4 as likely to seek mental health treatment. This was a slide back from 1998. It's since been, it's not much different in more recent studies. So 1/4 is likely to seek mental health treatment means that of 4 people who could have benefited from treatment, should have benefited from treatment, 3 of them are not getting it. So the vast majority of people who need mental health help are not getting it. There's a stronger sense of stigma. And once you show up in clinic, once you start, they're much more likely to drop out. So about 30% of people showing up at the clinic for the first time or after a few sessions don't come back. 50%, half of Asians, and remember, these are people who were reluctant to come in the first place. They finally make it through the door. They don't want to come anymore. And then this is the last little factoid there from a 1987 study. Asians are more likely to be covertly non-compliant. So when I do versions of this talk for psychiatrist colleagues, if they're non-Asian, and I ask, are Asians more likely to be compliant or non-compliant? They always answer, oh, more likely to be compliant, right? Because we're the model minority. We're polite. We say thank you. There's various reasons for this. There's the traditional respect for authority. In Chinese, at least, the phrase "any questions" is the same as "any problems." So a doctor asking, any questions is almost asking, do you have any problems? So 有没有问题, right? It's the same phrase. And so when they did this study in a refugee clinic, which was 100% Asian, a full 61% of the patients had no detectable levels of a particular antidepressant in their bloodstream. So this was before the modern antidepressants, when we had to regularly check levels in the bloodstream. And so this wasn't even a compliance study. This was just looking at, how are your blood levels doing? And 61% had no detectable level of the medication, the prescribed medication in their bloodstream. And another 24% had very low levels. So that's a whopping 85%, right? And when asked, the patients, had various reasons for not filling the prescription or taking the first dose and not taking it anymore, or being worried. But so this whole time then, the doctor thought that they were prescribing something, and they didn't know. And then they reached conclusions on how the patients are not being cooperative, or that they're untreatable in some way. And then additional things that I don't have on this slide are the family history tends to be negative. In Stanford Clinic, they were doing a study of bipolar disorder and looking at genetics. And, the genetics of bipolar disorder was the same for all groups except Asians, where it looked as though we had spontaneous mutations. I mean, we had the same level in this generation as everybody else, but there was no family history. So I'm joking when I said we have spontaneous mutations. That's not it. It's just that nobody talks about what happened in the previous generation. If I have time, I have a sad story of, well, I'll tell it now. It's a family where, when I asked about a history of depression or suicide, even before I finished the question, all the family members said no. So I figured that meant that there was something up. And so I asked, and so I started, saying, any accidental deaths. And they sort of looked at each other, and then they said, grandma fell in the well. And, to me, it seemed fairly obvious that the well didn't move around, but that it wasn't accidental, right? That the grandmother fell in the well, and that this was something that people said to feel better and to try to escape this awful stigma of it having been a suicide. And yet, not talking about it, not getting help for the current generation when they had depression or suicidal thoughts, that wasn't helping. The shame from not getting help, not talking about it, was complicit with the disease. It wasn't helping to make things better. And then we already talked about different expressions of pain. As I talked about, there's also different expressions of mental health. So American psychiatrists like to call it somatic symptoms, that it's easier for many cultures, not just Asians, but many immigrant cultures, to talk about physical pain rather than mental pain. So I have back pain, I have headaches, rather than saying, I'm depressed. I don't feel like I can get out of bed. I feel like life is useless. That's much harder to talk about. So now we're going to talk a little bit about microaggressions. Next slide, please. And this is a poem that I wrote in medical school many years ago. So rather than describe what microaggressions are, I'll indulge in a little poetry. When people ask me, where are you from? I answer, I was born in New York, or I grew up in Wisconsin, even though I know this is not what is really being asked. They might persist, but are you Chinese or Japanese? Or they might not. It's a small thing. It isn't the back of a bus. It isn't a train to Manzanar. But I know that my children and their children will have to explain what the children of white people will never be asked. I was born here. I live here. But it's a strange sort of home when you have to keep explaining what you're doing there. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about what to do. I've talked about the problem. Now we need to talk about what to do about it. I have slides on if you've experienced something, if you've done something, and also if you've witnessed something. So let's start with if you've experienced something. Do not ignore it. You can't help something if you don't know about it, and denial may help in the short term, but it costs more in the long term. It really does. Denying pain, not noticing mental pain, that's something that we're sometimes encouraged to do. Actually, after the Atlanta shooting, I got one of these free newspapers in my driveway that only my Asian neighbors got, and that has ads for acupuncture and so forth. And it said, discipline is the most important thing. If you feel angry, then it will back up the chi in your liver and you'll have high blood pressure or something. It's like, no, the opposite. Discipline, holding in the pain, denying it, that causes more high blood pressure. Recognizing it and doing something about it. If there's denial of physical pain, that is a dangerous neurological problem, right? That's, leprosy doesn't cause fingers and toes to fall off by themselves. It's because people are insensitive to pain. So you don't want to have the emotional equivalent of leprosy, right? Insensitivity to pain is dangerous. So don't feel bad for feeling bad. If you've had a microaggression or a macroaggression, physical violence, mental, anything, don't feel bad for feeling bad. That just makes it worse. Recognize that you feel bad, recognize that that's a feeling and that you may have good reason for it. And then what do? You can talk with someone and you can get allies, other people that have experienced similar things, other people that haven't, but don't be invisible, don't be alone. And in the sort of classic things to do about stress, fight or flight, remember there's other things you can do. So instead of fight or flight, you can flock. You can get together with other people. And we are social beings. Humans are social beings. We're mammals. So flocking with others, it's not only emotionally helpful, it's something that we need. It's also, in a practical sense, helpful. I don't know if you remember one of those videos from the dawn of YouTube where the wildebeest are able to save a calf by fighting off the lions. The wildebeests don't have teeth or claws, but they have the numbers. And so if you flock together, and remember, we have to flock across groups. We have to flock with other Asians and with non-Asians because there's not enough of us to do this alone. If you've experienced something and you look at the various factors, it doesn't mean that you imagined it, but it does give you perspective. And I'll talk more about that at the end. I have examples of that. And for example, the obstetrics resident, when I was a medical student, you could call that a microaggression, I think it was. But if I just thought of him as being evil, if I went and, if I hated him for the rest of my life, that wouldn't have done any good. But if we can get education, get our voices heard, that's much more useful. If you've experienced something, you should have permission to pick it up and put it down. So remember I showed you my file, my very thick, heavy file of clippings and so forth. One of the reasons that I do this as clippings instead of, trolling the internet the whole time is because I can pick it up and put it down. People send me stuff. If I'm not in the mood where I can read it right now, I bookmark it, print it out, whatever. If there's things in the paper, there's some days that I can read it right away, and there's others days I clip it out and I put it in the file, and then when I'm ready, I read it. So you do have permission to pick it up and put it down. Remember that the model of learned helplessness in rats is that the ones who have their entire cage electrified, they get depressed. They stop grooming, they stop eating, they can dwindle away and die from not eating. the rats who have the same amount of foot shock and the same intensity, but can jump from one end of the cage to the other. And remember, the ones who can't escape they're relieved of the foot shock when the other rats jump. So they have exactly the same amount and intensity. But the only difference is that the rats with the escapable foot shock, they have some control over when they experience it, and so they don't get depressed. So you need to be given permission to put it up, to pick it up and put it down. And remember that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who talked about stages of grief and dying, that these are stages that also occur in any kind of bad news. This is something that the National Alliance on Mental Illness taught me that I think is wonderful. You can go through outcry, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance, action. You can do all these, and these are all natural, normal stages in grief and in stress. So I can go through 3 stages in a day easily, but also what you go through can be different this stage versus another, and you can go back to an earlier stage. But remember, other people can as well. And so this is, as I take care of patients in the hospital, family members often are like, I don't know why she's, eat, sleep, breathing this diagnosis, or I don't know why he doesn't care about our child, right? As we're talking about violence, you may have people who are sort of like, it doesn't affect me that much. So they're in denial. And then you might be in a stage where you're feeling like bargaining or depression, like bargaining is, if I could just do this. And that might not be a long lasting stage. That might be helpful or not, but give other people permission to be at different stages as well. And then when things do get better, pay it forward. This period you've had where you've experienced something terrible, something hurtful and wounding, you'll get through this, and then later on you'll be able to help someone else. Next slide, please. So recommendations if you've done something. I guess I'll start with the golden rule with a twist, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you if you were in their shoes. That's an important twist on the golden rule. So the number of times people have said, I don't mind if someone asks me where I'm from. I'm proud of my heritage. It's like, yeah, but did they round you guys up and put them in camps? Or if you're male and a behavior doesn't seem egregious, it's like, oh, I wouldn't mind if someone gave me a back rub. I wouldn't mind if, someone put their hand on me and, asked me to lunch, complimented what I'm wearing. If the behavior doesn't seem that egregious, then imagine it happening in front of your mother or sister or daughter, or happening to your mother or sister or daughter. And if you haven't been in their shoes, and, none of us have experienced everything, and so try not to get defensive. Find out more about, like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. I have examples of this as well, where I think it's been very helpful to help people see what it's like to be in my shoes, and also things that I haven't thought of. I think we all reflexly can get defensive. I remember someone telling me, Dr. Hu, you've never been hungry. And my immediate reaction was, I felt kind of insulted. I thought, of course I've been hungry. And then I thought, no, not in the way that this patient has. Not anywhere close to that. Remember that things that work when you're in a position of power or privilege are not the same for someone else. And so these days, if someone, asks me certain questions that would have been difficult when I was younger and, not an associate dean, now some of these things I can brush off, but I have to realize that for someone who's not in a position of power, it's not so easy. And this technique of the golden rule with a twist, trying to see not just what you'd have them do unto you, but if you were in their shoes, it's been very helpful with colleagues and family members and patients. And when I've needed help, I've used it, and then also when I've had the opportunity to help other people. Next slide, please. So recommendations if you've done something. This is why I started with the golden rule. If you've been accused of a microaggression, if somebody pulled you aside and said, wait, that was that was unfair, that was uncool. Start by listening. It's very difficult to listen when you feel like you've been accused of something, but you have to start by listening to what the other person experienced. And then, of course, if there's more than one person, really, really listen. So if there's 2 examples, there are probably more. And this is where you can learn to do something differently. Remember, even if you're thinking, I'm not a racist, oh, I'm the least racist person ever, I don't see color, I'm not sexist, I can't, it's not an immutable character trait. It's not plus or minus. Look at whether your actions contributed to hurting someone. So I don't consider myself sexist, but my daughter has called me on a few things. Like, that was an interesting assumption that you made. It's like, oh, okay. As I'm talking about microaggressions, and I realize that this is a mixed audience, and so some people might think, oh, well, if I'm not Asian, she's talking about me. But Asians often perpetrate microaggressions, right? Some of the most sexist things I've heard have been from Asians, and we can be racist towards ourselves, towards other Asians, towards other groups. But we can learn. So, my 90-year-old father used to call, he was a university professor before he retired. He used to call female students co-eds. And I had to explain to him that co-eds meant that, men were educated and women were trying to marry them. And it wasn't a helpful phrase. And he learned. So, if my 90-year-old father can learn, I think we all can. Remember that intent matters, but impact matters more. So if I drop a book on your toes, and I didn't mean to, the impact of your broken toes should mean that I should apologize. I shouldn't just walk away. I shouldn't blame you for having your toes there. Of course, if I keep dropping books on people's toes, then I should look at that. But if you were to open a door onto someone and, break their nose, you would, of course, apologize. It wouldn't matter that you hadn't meant to. I mean, it matters, but the first thing you should do is apologize and to listen. Is this something that keeps happening? So not my fault, which if I dropped a book on your toes or opened a door into your face, that would not be my fault, but not my responsibility. I should then look at, do I habitually open the door too quickly, right? So there are things that are understandable, saying not my fault, but helpful. When you apologize, always apologize genuinely, like, I'm so sorry. Not, I'm sorry you were hurt, which kind of puts it on them, or you took it the wrong way, or you're too sensitive. That's one of my favorite ones. Apologize genuinely. You are sorry that you did that. You are sorry. I'm sorry that I said that. I'm sorry that I hurt you. And then don't expect immediate absolution. People get very angry if they sort of say, well, I apologized, and then like, are you okay? And then if the person doesn't, absolve them immediately, then they're sort of like, well, I tried to apologize. It's sort of like, apologize, try to make it right, take some time to do that. And remember, you can learn from mistakes. This is how we learn. Try to treat it as a gift. That's difficult, but it's important. And I like to quote Maya Angelou on this. She said, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Next slide, please. So now, probably an easier slide. What do you do if you're a bystander? Try not to be a bystander. Try to be an upstander. Stand up for the victim. Listen, be a witness, don't look away. Remember, the wounded party can't do all the work. Step up, listen to their input about what to do and when, and then expect this to change. The last part I think is important, because if it's just sort of like, okay, are you okay? Okay, good. And then you leave. Not long ago, I happened upon an elderly woman who was down on the street, and there was a bicyclist near her. And I didn't attack the bicyclist, because the bicyclist very quickly said, I didn't do it. I didn't knock her over. The woman had fallen, the bicyclist had stopped, and we both asked, can we help? And she was flustered, and she was, I think, a little embarrassed and so forth. So she said, no. But we didn't just leave. We waited a little bit. We stepped back enough to sort of give her some space, and then when it was clear that she was going to be okay, then we left. But we didn't just, say, okay, never mind. If you're in a position of power, you can stand up to a bully, someone who is perpetrating microaggressions. If you're friends, remember that that standing up to the bully is not getting them into trouble, it's getting them out of trouble. They've already said or done something that hurt somebody. Helping them evolve is a good thing. And if you're not in a position of power, at least let the victim know that you see or hear them. And so you can distract or diffuse. And some examples of this are, if you come upon something where you see someone picking on someone, you can ask for directions. Hey, does anyone know where the Starbucks is? Or you could, if you're similar in some way, ethnicity or age or something to the victim, you could pretend to know them. You could be like, oh, sorry, I'm late. Nai nai, po po, like let's go have tea. Oh, sorry. And then take them out of the scene. Next slide, please. I've borrowed these from Hollaback does Upstander training. So 5 Ds of being an Upstander. Direct is very good, but sometimes it's not possible. So you're in a meeting and somebody says something that's clearly a microaggression. You can say, that's not fair. If you're out and about and it seems like someone is menacing an elderly person, you could say, give her some room. You can distract. So I used the example of asking for directions. If you're in a meeting at work, you can be like, hey, I just remembered something, and then try to take that off. Document, remember how many really scary things have been brought to attention only because someone was there. And, so everything from Rodney King to George Floyd. Post these only with permission of the victim, but if you have had a microaggression done on you and you tell a friend, write it in a diary, something like that, even if you're not up for confronting the perpetrator right away, you have some record of it. And then if people try to say you imagined it later, you've documented it. 4th D is delay. You can check in later with the victim. If the bully is someone in power, much bigger than you, and so forth, check in with the victims. Like, I saw that. Are you okay? And then, of course, if you can check in with the perpetrator later, if you're able to, it's like, I think that came across badly. I think you might want to say that differently another time. When we did Music Key West was a program that we were doing before the pandemic, where professional musicians were helping stop bullying in schools. Well, guess what? The musicians also went back to their own symphonies and stood up for, the clarinetist that was being picked on, the second violinist, and would tell the conductor sort of, it's like, you were being kind of harsh there. He was doing the best he could. And then delegate. Let's talk with your supervisor. Can I report this to someone who can help? If you're at a, if you're in a public place, you could go to customer service. You could do something where someone in power can help. When I was young, there was a family who cut in line in front of us at Disneyland and laughed in our faces, and everyone else saw it. They might have been afraid of the family that was the loud family, but I think if they had gone to park officials and said something, I think that would have helped. And I would like to be the person in the future to do something and not just and not be a bystander. I would like to be the upstander in the future. Next slide, please. So what to do starting now? Don't hurt yourself. Don't hurt other people. This includes substance abuse. So there are things that make you angry. It's not really helpful to victimize somebody else with your anger. Take that anger and turn it into something productive. Care for yourself and other people. And remember, adrenaline, that fight or flight reaction, needs some outlet. In the past, we had to run away from wild animals. Now we can exercise. Take that adrenaline and do Zumba, do something, run. talk with people, listen to people. So I try to make all of my patients who are under stress have some time to exercise. It's not the only answer, but it's helpful. And then when people try to divide you or other people, you know, don't fall for that. Don't participate. It's very understandable because it helps us feel temporarily better. It's like it won't happen to me. I showed you the Japanese internment orders. I didn't hear about that in school, and later on, when I heard about it, I remember my mother said, "Oh, well, they were Japanese, they weren't Chinese," and so forth. That's so easy to do. I've done it myself, where this isn't an anti-Asian one, but I remember hearing about this horrible nightclub fire in Rhode Island, and my first response was, "I've never been to Rhode Island, and I don't like heavy metal." It make you feel temporarily better, but it's really not helpful. So my next thought after that, so I'm not an evil person for having had that as the first thought, but then I thought, well, that's ridiculous. People who like heavy metal and live in Rhode Island don't deserve to have awful things happen to them. Rather than just othering them, I should appreciate their suffering, and if there's something that I can do to help, to do that. So identify the problems, learn from them, and then get support. I'm going to say it again. I said it before. Denial only works for a short time. Next slide, please. And I do want to leave enough time for questions, so I will tell this story as quickly as possible. I was in a small town called Esperanza on the little island of Vieques, which is off of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is an island. Vieques is an even smaller island. And I was with my husband. We were walking along the beach nearby, and then a man began to shout racial slurs at me, the same kind of things that I had heard all through my childhood, including obscenities. And what's interesting is, the movie by Kurosawa, Rashomon, where you can look from my perspective, my husband's perspective, and the man's perspective. I yelled Spanish obscenities back at him because I knew many of them. I grew up in San Diego and I've taken Spanish classes. And then my husband sort of dragged me away by the elbows saying, "What are you doing? That's not helpful." And I first told my husband, it's like, you don't understand. You didn't have dinner every night of your growing up interrupted by people telling us to go home and telling us, obscenities. You didn't have that. And at first my husband said, well, I was overweight and people made fun of me for being fat. And I told him he was wrong because, being fat is not saying, I don't think anybody wanted my husband to die for being overweight. Whereas, as you know, there's been times that people would like everyone who looks like me to go away or just not exist. But then my husband pointed out that the man shouting racial slurs, was living on an island that had been used as a bombing range by the United States, and that he was poor, and that he was drinking out of a paper bag, and that the other people in Vieques were drinking downtown, together, and that this was a man who apparently had no friends. So by the time my husband was done talking with me, I was ready to go back and offer the man social services and do what I could to make his life better. And so all of us were right and all of us were wrong, right? I had a right to my feelings, but I was wrong to yell back at him. I don't think that was particularly helpful. But I was okay. I wasn't a bad person for having that impulse. My husband did not understand truly what I was going through because my husband's not Asian, he's white, and he didn't have the same kind of stresses that I had had, but he had others. And so when I understood a little bit, and also when I helped him understand what I'd been through, it went better. I felt better. And of course, the man's perspective, when my husband helped me see that it wasn't entirely, that I shouldn't take it personally, that of course what he yelled at me was ugly and wrong, but that another couple walking by, he would yell different things at them. And so letting that man hurt me, make me hate Vieques or Puerto Rico would be not the right response. So I've been to Puerto Rico many times since then, I think at least 7 times. I contributed towards the relief efforts after the hurricane. I love Puerto Rico. I didn't let that one man saying hateful things and his actions stop me. And for those of you who speak Spanish, the word esperanza means hope. Next slide, please. These are some of my colleagues, Dr. Stephen Sust, Amia Nash, who were part of CHIPAO and continue to be. Next slide, please. And I'd like to thank the Department of Psychiatry, CARE, of course, for sponsoring the talk tonight. My inpatient colleagues, Inspired Smart Clinic, the resident cast and crew of CHIPAO, the DEI committee and the Diversity Coalition School of Medicine, many of these authors and writers who I've borrowed some of the examples from, and then of course, my mentors and trainees and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hu, for a wonderful talk today and very insightful as well as moving. I want to remind the audience we are entering the Q&A portion in our last 6 minutes of the talk. Please submit your questions on the Q&A for us, and I will relay them to Dr. Hu, but perhaps I will open. We have 101 participants tonight, so good showing today. Do you have any thoughts about whether anti-Asian sentiment has changed? Is this more revealed? Have we then now responded to it well? How do you feel this has evolved over the past 2 years?
I think it's evolved. So, part of the looking at the history is to remind people that this isn't new, but it has evolved. I think politics does have something to do with it. I think that whenever people are feeling fearful, then there's more scapegoating, and so we've just had the 20th anniversary of September 11th, and friends of mine who are Muslim, people who are not Muslim but are brown skinned, are people who are Sikh and wear turbans. A lot of people had very ugly anti-Asian and anti-other group, anti-minority things happen. And so when people feel threatened, a lot of times they respond by becoming hateful, becoming angry, and so forth. So I think some of the recent politics and the pandemic made it more difficult. As I was talking about, things that can be that we can all perpetrate microaggressions and so forth. I remember some of the previous microaggressions that I experienced were at the time that people felt like Asians were taking the jobs. And so when I had something very scary happen, someone like trying to run me off the road and yelling slurs at me, and I went home to my non-Asian roommate in medical school and said what had happened. She said, well, I'm not surprised. The Japanese are taking away all the auto and manufacturing jobs. But I want to mention this not because obviously at the time what she said hurt me even more than I felt like the guy, running me off the road. He was frightening, but I didn't expect anything from him and I was never going to see him again. Her saying that really felt bad, but I didn't let that stop me. I explained to her, I said, I'm not taking anybody's jobs. It's like you and I are both medical students. We're trying to save people. It's like, it's not fair for him to run me off the road. And I explained to her, she said, oh, well, people think I'm dumb because I'm blonde. And I said, again, not the same. It's like, that must have been hurtful, but this is a whole nother level of hurt, And we kept talking. It wasn't easy, but neither of us gave up, and we're still friends. We exchange Christmas cards every year, and she has a lovely family, um, and I didn't just label her as being, oh, you're racist, oh, you're anti-Asian. It's sort of like, you're my friend, and you just said something that wasn't very sensitive, and we explained, and she explained why she said it, and I explained why I felt how I felt, and we got past it.
This leads well into our next question from Dr. Rex Chu in your story. This is your friend, somebody you know, but he asks, how do you engage with people who do not want to rationally discuss and have hatred?
Yeah, the ones who don't want to rationally discuss, you might not be able to right then. You might not be able to engage. And so a lot of these have more than one answer, and a lot of these will have an answer in the moment. And by the way, hi, Dr. Chu. Thanks for being here. So there are going to be times, for example, if this is happening at work and they're not able to rationally discuss it, that would be a good time to go to someone else at work who might be able to help. Remember, I said that I have learned a lot in the dean's office. This is something that we want to deal with, and a lot of times we can help people, use the rational parts of themselves, and also use the emotional parts of themselves. And if there's hatred and anger, sometimes we can help them see the folly of that and direct that better. So there's going to be times that you can engage directly. In a way, using the 5 Ds of being an upstander, you can also use some of those if you are the one that's being microaggressed against. So,
Great.
yeah. And then, of course, all of the self-care things that I talked about.
A couple more questions. I'm going to try to combine them. One question was about seeing more Black on Asian violence. So what's your perception on kind of conflict between groups of color? And then related question, as an immigrant, I often feel discriminated, especially by Asian Americans who feel superior because they were born here. How do you suggest dealing with this?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think I'm going to have to answer those separately, if you don't mind. The feeling discriminated against by Asian Americans who feel superior just because they were born here, that's a thing. You're not imagining it. It's often, I think, a way to deal with it's othering someone so that you feel better, right? So keep engaging with them. It's easy for people who were born and grew up here to not have accents. I think it was only until I lived and worked in France that I realized it's exhausting to speak another language all day long. And I don't think I recognized that with my parents until then. I'm realizing that as in the home that I was sort of like, I was born here, I live here, and that's something that it's an understandable response, but it's not helpful. So if you can keep engaging and realize that you're not imagining it when people do that, but also that when people are doing that it doesn't mean they're evil. It's a comforting thing for them to do temporarily. So yeah, thanks for bringing that to my attention, because I think I've been guilty of that from time to time. It's at least temporarily comforting, but not good in the long term.
We're a little bit over time, so I'm just going to skip to maybe one last question that's a little different, from Peggy Chang. When the Asian violence was happening, my Chinese mother said, change is difficult since there aren't enough Asians in politics, and thus we are not in a position of power. Do you agree with this? Do you know of organizations that try to help Asians enter politics?
I don't know about organizations. I think Stop Asian Hate and Stop AAPI Hate are, I think, helpful. But I think your Chinese mother is very right that if there aren't any Asians in politics, and a lot of times I think we've been encouraged to just sort of lie low and not go for positions of power. This is starting to change. I remember you, Dr. Lin, helped in Medicine the Muse have that honoring Asian grandmothers, and there was Judge Lillian Singh and so forth. So it's happening more. You know, start by voting. I hope you all voted today. You don't have a voice if you don't vote. Vote, get involved, talk to, and then support people. You don't have to agree with everybody all the time, but at least support their being in politics, and so forth. One of the local city council women had really vile prejudice against her, and I've offered to help either speak at a rally for her, so forth like that. It's not necessarily that I've agreed with every single thing she said the whole time, but she did not do anything to deserve that type of vituperation. And if I'm in a position of power, I'm gonna do what I can. There's a couple of questions. Can I do them very quickly?
Sure, yeah.
What should we do when someone yells, "Go back to your country"? You can ignore them. I mean, you have many options. Go back to your country, and it's like, or you could say, if you want to, you can say, "I'm here." You can. So you could ignore them. This is, I had this handy for a different talk, but when there was a lot of this like very anti-Asian stuff, sort of like, I now have this handy for anyone. This is me from 25 years ago. And Dr. Lin, you're supposed to say, "You look exactly the same."
Well, your hair is different, so I can't say that.
There we are. That's the only thing that's different from 25 years ago. But I think sometimes I've reacted by kind of trying to prove my patriotism, which is one way of doing it. It's not necessarily the only way, and it has its downsides as well. But recently when somebody said, "Go back to China," I said, "I've never been to China." But then I also thought, I don't know if that's the best answer, because he doesn't, the people who are from China also don't deserve his hate. So think about what are things that would feel right to you, and it might be different in different situations. And then there's a question: what do you recommend to deal with Asian Chinese who do not think Asian hate exists? So those are the people that I was talking about when I said, when I said people will go through different stages, and you do what works for you and what's helpful. They may get there at some point, but I try not to let that other us, because I have family members who've dealt with the recent politics very differently than I do. I'm not going to stop speaking to them. I probably won't be able to convince them to my point of view, and I don't think they'll convince me to their point of view, but I feel like we're all dealing with things in a way that if we all keep the dialogue going, then that's what's really helpful.
Perfect. Thank you for such a wonderfully enlightening and wise talk, and thank you for fielding the questions. Really appreciate the audience for joining us today. Please go to care.stanford.edu for more information about the Center for Asian Health Research and Education. And please join us next month, October 12th, for our next talk on understanding gastric cancer and its relationship to the immune system and microenvironment with Dr. Andrew Lee. Thank you again, Dr. Hu, and thanks also to the Stanford Health Library.
Thank you, everyone.